Hi everybody, this is the video lecture on questionnaires. So specifically this is going to be about constructing questionnaires. And there's a chapter in the book that's related to this, but there's no PowerPoint for this lecture. I'm just going to go through the steps with you about constructing questionnaires. Do watch the video on psychological measurement if you need to understand self-reports and questionnaires a little bit better. That lecture went through various aspects of that, but this is more of a practical lecture in terms of how to construct questionnaires. And my guess is that even if you don't go into grad school or research or anything like that, given that you're a psych major, one of the things that you might be asked to do on the job, that could be in the business world or in a regular office, etc., is to construct a questionnaire. So businesses like to have questionnaires for their customers to see what their customers think of them. You might work for a place and they have a new product or a new event or something they're trying to promote or sell to people, and they want to pilot test it and maybe get questionnaires to see what people think of the thing. So these types of skills you might actually use in the real world also. And so here's how you go about constructing a questionnaire. So we already talked about having conceptual definitions. So the conceptual definition is the first step. So whatever concept you're looking at, you need a conceptual definition. And that conceptual definition, as we said before, should have details about different ways that the construct can manifest. And what does that mean? That means various ways we can see this construct. So if you remember, we talked about that psychological constructs are things that we think are internal processes that we necessarily can't directly observe, but we can observe their manifestations. And their manifestations can deal with things such as how people think, how people feel, how people behave. We can observe these things. We can measure these things. So again, questionnaires are for self-report, so we're going to be asking people about these things. So an example that I could use possibly is if I think about narcissism, and I'm going to just do this real quickly on this thing here. So narcissism, so if I think about various ways it can manifest, maybe it will manifest in terms of thinking. They think they're perfect, they never make mistakes, they think they're better than other people. Actually, they think other people are stupid and inferior than them. They think that they're entitled. So actually, maybe I should put this as the thinking, just to sort of highlight this for everybody. So in terms of their thinking, these are just some aspects. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'm just giving you some examples. And they think they're entitled, which means they think that they deserve good things only. So anyway, I can go on and on. So I'll just sort of put this here. So in my conceptual definition, I'm thinking about the different manifestations. And so I can think about also how they feel. So how do they feel? Did it deny vulnerability, negative feelings? And, you know, we'll see that some of these things there's no clear barrier sometimes between thinking, feeling, and behavior. But I'm thinking I'm going to put this here. They have superficial relationships. These could be friendships or romantic relationships, which means basically they lack commitment, they lack deep emotions, Sometimes we'll just say it's just for fun. And again, we would just list, oops, I'm not going to say that. We're just going to list a bunch of these ways that narcissism can manifest. So that's feeling. And then we can think also in terms of their behavior, so how they act. And again, there's no necessarily clear lines between these things, but this is just a way of helping us think of ideas for our conceptual definitions. So how do they behave? So often as we say they're haughty is a good word, but basically it just means they're arrogant. So they act in an arrogant fashion. They can act aggressive, especially if somebody's slightly critical. Doesn't even have to be much, or perceived to be critical of them. Avoid stressful and negative situations because they don't like to feel like they're vulnerable. And again, it goes on and on. So here you see we have that first step. We have it pretty well laid out, this conceptual definition. Oh, by the way, as I'm going through this, you're going to be doing these things for a lab exercise. So that's why in some ways I'm doing a bit of examples here. And so, conceptual definition, so we have various manifestations, considering how they think, feel, behave, or whatever the construct is, whatever construct you're looking at, how that would influence thinking, feeling, how people act towards each other, behavior. That's one way to frame it. And so here I've outlined what's the good makings of a conceptual definition for narcissism. So it's actually, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's relatively straightforward. So once we have the conceptual definition, then we brainstorm questions using these aspects. So we want to brainstorm. So you want to generate a lot of possible questions for each thing. Usually we might generate or brainstorm 10 questions for every one that we would use. That's typically what we would do. And when we say brainstorm, we just brainstorm. You just write down a bunch of ideas. Don't care about whether it's good. You shouldn't be writing something down and say, oh, is that good or is that, no. Just get down ideas and you can revise things later. And so by every aspect, here we have a bunch of things we can write about. So I can write questions about somebody thinking they're perfect and never make mistakes. So I can think about a number of questions that can measure that. Self-report questions, so you're asking somebody on a questionnaire. A bunch of questions about assessing that they think they're better than others. Questions about them denying vulnerability, denying negative feelings. And again, your questions should be such that we keep in mind the stuff we talked about earlier, which from the last lecture of psychological measurement, which is for a self-report question to work well, or a questionnaire to work well, there's several conditions to get valid data. One of the conditions is that the person understands the question. So we don't do that during brainstorming, but when we edit, we'll think about, is it clear to the person what we're asking? Also, when we're generating questions here, we want to think about, well, we want truthful answers. So one thing is that people might lie to look better. For narcissists, we don't have to really worry about that too much, but in general, you have to think a little bit about that. You don't want to make it so obvious that they're sort of a a good positive answer, because if you have it written in a way that sounds like it's a really good thing, it's going to be hard for people to say, no, I'm not that good thing. And then for narcissists and other people, we also are a bit worried about they might not have access to the information. So, for example, if you write something like, do you deny your vulnerability? Well, nobody has access to that. So you have to think about ways to write about that. For those, probably I would write things like, I rarely feel sad. I always like to think about positive things. I usually have answers to any situation. So trying to get to the sense that they don't think they're ever vulnerable, that they always think that they can get out of it. So you want to think a little bit about that when you're brainstorming. But again, you're probably not doing the fine editing yet. So for feelings, we just did that. Behavior, so of course you want to ask somebody if they're arrogant, but you might think about, well, what would an arrogant person act like? I like to be first in line. I like to be at the top of the class, or I like to be first in doing something. You know, there's various ways that we can sort of get to this without it being so obvious that we think they're arrogant, or we're asking about them being arrogant, because again, arrogant is a negative thing, and most people don't want to admit to it. So we want to be a little bit clever in how we phrase these things, and this is why we want to brainstorm a bunch of questions. So all these different bullet points that we have here from our conceptual definition, we can brainstorm questions about. And so you can start seeing here that we're starting to fill out probably quite a few questions. We'll have a lot of things there. And then our next step, we should probably start thinking about scaling before we do fine editing. What does that mean? Well, how are we gonna phrase our bullet points? Because that's what people do, right? They fill in a little bubble, or on online questionnaires, you just click the button, you fill in a bubble. So how are you going to phrase it? Are you going to phrase it in terms of things like strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree? For example, if I write something like, for narcissist, I rarely cry. You know, so strongly agree, yes, I hardly ever cry. Strongly disagree, I cry all the time. But if I think about it in terms of sometimes people have frequency, which would be something like always, often, and maybe sometimes, and maybe never, something like that. So if I have that, I could simply probably put I cry. Well, I cry, I'm always crying, I often cry, I sometimes cry, I never cry. So think a little bit about the phrasing of the questions. I shouldn't say the questions, of the answers to the questions. So I prefer to have the agreement thing, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, because it's a little bit more flexible. I find it's a little bit more easy, or easier, I should say, not more easy, a little bit easier to write questions that somebody's agreeing to or not agreeing to, versus the always, often, sometimes, never. Sometimes phrasing those questions are difficult. And what I'll say is, for your lab assignment, your phrasing should be the same for all your questions. So you don't want to write some questions that are agree and then some questions that are always, sometimes. It gets very difficult for the participant to sort of answer these properly. And then also, if you're changing the scale, can you really add those things together? I'm not sure. So I would say choose one phrasing and stick with it for all of your questions. This is why we're talking about this before you do your fine editing. And then we also want to just think about the number of options. When I'm saying options, I'm saying answer options. Like this would have 4. This would have 4 also. So one thing that you want to decide probably right away is, do we want a midpoint? So do we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where there's a midpoint, 3. So 3 is a midpoint. It's the middle answer. Whoops. Yeah, we don't want to do that. And so it's versus something that doesn't have a midpoint, which would be something like 1, 2, 3, 4. So as you might guess from my options above, I like to avoid midpoints. I don't like midpoints because sometimes it's a way that people end up not answering your question. So there are some people who don't want to answer your question, don't want to make a decision, and they're going to say all 3s, and it's not going to be very good data because they really haven't thought about it. They're just trying to avoid the question. They're not thinking about it that deeply. So midpoints to me, I don't like it. So if you had a midpoint, for example, here in the agree options, it would go strongly agree, agree, and then obviously on the other side it's disagree, strongly disagree. In the middle there would be something like neither agree or disagree. So that would probably be the middle for that. For one, I don't like that answer. You know, how do I make sense of that? What does that mean? Does it mean you don't understand the question? Does it mean that you don't give a crap and you're not even going to think about it? Or are you truly in the middle? So that might be something you're thinking about. You may be thinking that, well, what if somebody's truly in the middle? Let's say you have narcissism and somebody truly is in the middle. They're not super narcissistic and they're not narcissistic. They're in the middle somewhere. Yes, there are a lot of people in the middle, but what you do is you're not relying on one question to identify that. If they're in the middle, they'll show up in the middle, because if they're in the middle, they'll say 2 sometimes, they'll see 3 sometimes, and so, which I just noticed I should probably flip this. So, by the way, strongly agree would be 4, agree would be 3, because you want the more they are of the thing, the more they say yes to the question, the higher the number. So it'd actually be in this order. So what you do is, you know, when you actually have quite a few questions, if they really are in the middle, you're going to say 2 sometimes, they're going to say 3 sometimes, they're going to say 2 sometimes, 3 times, maybe there's a 4, maybe there's a 1. So basically when you add up all of those questions, they will end up in the middle. So if people are in the middle, they'll end up in the middle because they'll end up in the middle after you ask a bunch of questions. You don't need one question to make sure they're in the middle. And so, as you can tell, I'm not a big believer in midpoints because, again, it usually is used by people to avoid the question. By avoiding the midpoints, it actually gets people to think a little bit more about the question. Well, I have to say yes or no, even though it's slight. I have to think a little bit about that. So anything that gets your participants thinking more is better. And then we're at the point, by the way, so I'm sorry, I missed one thing here. I think I'm going to put this on the same page. Sorry about that. And so we also just want the number of options. So we talked about the midpoint. So do we want, if we don't have a midpoint, do we want 1 through 4? Or do you want 1 through 6? Or do you want 1 through 8? Sometimes you hear people say, well, I want to have a lot of different choices because it will make people more spread out. When they say that, they probably don't understand statistics well. it's going to be spread out anyway. It doesn't matter if it's a 4-point scale. Your variance is going to be accommodated in terms of your statistics for that, so you don't really need to worry about that. What I worry about, though, is if you have a lot of options, oftentimes it's hard for people to distinguish between them. So what's the difference between a 6 and a 5? What's the difference between a 1 and a 2? It can be very difficult for people to distinguish those things. So I generally favor a smaller amount of options because I have more confidence that people can distinguish between these things. Now, if I have like sort of slightly disagree and somewhat disagree, who knows what people think what that is? You know, if I put in an extra point, are they really making a good differentiation between those two? I kind of doubt that. I'm much more comfortable with smaller number of options. And so for your lab exercise, you don't have to write these things out. You can just simply state it. You can simply state, my questionnaire is using this scale, and you can spell it out. And I'm using a 4-point scale, 6-point scale, 7-point scale. Just spell it out. Just write it on the top. You don't need to produce buttons or anything like that. You can just have your questions underneath that. And also for your lab exercise we'll talk about this, but you're going to be detailing these steps. So for each step, you're going to give the detail, so I can see your steps and see your process. And pretty much we're getting close to the end here. Is now we want to do our fine editing. So we're going to be editing our, I should probably just put this as steps. We're going to be editing our questions, keeping in mind the things such as to get a good valid answer, it should be understandable, so somebody can read the question and understand what we're asking them. And we don't want people to be reactive to it. What does that mean? We don't want them lying to make themselves look good, or feel like they have to be defensive about something. So we want our questions to be such that it's clear what we're measuring, but we also don't want them to become reactive to it and give us weird answers that are not accurate. And then basically, so we're editing our questions, and then you're going to make your final choices. So you're going to be making your final choices. In this case, we're just going to make our final choices, based on our judgments. So we're going to make a judgment about the best questions. And I'm going to have you generate a questionnaire that's between 10 and 20 questions for the lab exercise. And I would say, depending on what you're measuring, that's probably within a good range of what you typically would want to ask. You don't want to ask too many questions, because then people get fatigued or sick of your questions. So for your lab exercise, shoot for 10 to 20 questions in your final questionnaire. Just make sure that it has the domain coverage, so the conceptual validity, the concept validity that we talked about in the psychological measurement. And that just basically means make sure you're choosing good questions for all of these bullet points that you had in your conceptual definition. If you end up just asking about this stuff, you think, oh, these are the best questions, you don't ask about these things, it's not going to be very good. So you should have a representation of, basically an equal representation of all the different bullet points that you have. So you want the good domain coverage. If this was an actual study, you would also do what we call pilot testing. What does that mean? You just give it to some people to test it out. So we can just say try out. It's trying it out. Does it work? So usually you give this to people who, you might give this to friends or other people you know. It's not research, it's just piloting the questionnaire. And typically what you would do here is you would probably want maybe 2 times the questions that you actually want. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to try out just your your questions that you think are going to be good, and then you end up having to throw out a quarter of them, and you have to go back again and you have to repilot. So you don't want to repilot a bunch of times. So maybe having about like twice the questions you're actually going to use, because you know you might throw out some things. And then what you do is you have the person take it, and then you're going to ask the person if they have any questions. Things such as, were any questions unclear? So remember, to be a good question, they have to understand the question. So you might actually give it to them. You don't want them talking to you during the time they're taking it, but you can just sort of say, well, if there's a question that you don't understand, just circle it or something, you know, so they can mark it and talk about it later. You might follow up on some things. So if you think that you wrote a question, and it's a really good question, but you're not sure if it's too subtle and they might not actually get to the point. So if there's any questions that you want to follow up about and make sure that they're working well because you were a bit uncertain about them, make sure you do that. And then of course you want to give it to enough people that you look at their answers. So you're curious about things like that you want to make sure that different people give different answers. So if you give it to a group of 10 people that you know, and they all say the same thing, it's not a good questionnaire. You're not differentiating between people. So you want to make sure people are giving different answers. You want to make sure that people are not doing what we call response sets, which is basically they're saying like one thing all the time. So they're saying 1 all the time, or they're saying 4 all the time, or they're saying a midpoint all the time. So you want to make sure that there's no response sets. If there's some sort of response set, you might want to think about why is that? Are the questions so long that they're not reading them, etc. So, and that's something that you do in your editing, by the way. In your editing, part of the understandability is you want to make sure it's as concise as possible, but of course you have to explain it. So the questions shouldn't be too long, and if they're really short, maybe they don't understand it. So make sure that you look out for being too wordy. So you do the pilot testing when you're doing your final choices, and then basically there's your questionnaire. And so again, in your lab exercise for this, I want you to show all of this work, show all of your steps. So the step of the conceptual definition. What I'll say is that, and this will say it in the instructions, your lab exercise, I want you to do a construct that's not part of your research project. So in your research project, there's already existing measures and existing questionnaires for the most part. So I want you to do some sort of construct that you're interested in, but that's not part of your project. So you're going to show your steps, you're going to show your conceptual definition. Generation. It's probably good if you use something like this to help you derive things. And then you're going to brainstorm your questions. So I'd make that into a next section, and maybe you're just going to simply cut and paste your definition that you have up here, and then you can write a bunch of questions. So you can simply have this, and then you could write a question here, you can write a question here, you can write a question here. That would be fine. I'm just thinking whether you should cut and paste that. I would prefer you cut and paste it, so I would like to see your conceptual definition without your questions first. Then you might cut and paste your conceptual definition, and then write your questions in there. So that's your brainstorming of the questions, and I would just highlight these sections. So in bold, underline, put conceptual definition, and then when you're done with that, brainstorming questions, and then you can cut and paste your definition and then start generating questions under it. Then have a section for scaling. So let me know what your scale is going to be, what your phrasing is going to be, the number of options, whether you're going to have a midpoint, and have it spelled out. So if you whatever scale you use, put it in words. And then your final section is fine editing. So there, you don't necessarily have to show me all your steps. You can just show me your final choices. So your final choices where you've edited it, You've made your questions as concise as they can be. You feel they're understandable to somebody. You don't have to pilot test it. In fact, don't pilot test it. We're not in a controlled situation here, so don't pilot test it. Just do this judgments that we've talked about. And so in that last section, then you're just going to have your finalized questionnaire, or questions, I should say, on your questionnaires. Again, it should be 10 to 20 questions. Make sure you have the domain coverage. And that's basically it. So that's how you construct a questionnaire. Those are the steps, and there's examples I've given here. And then this is what you're going to be doing for your lab exercise also, going through these steps. And that will give you the practice that you would normally have been doing in a research project, but we're not collecting data because of the summer and because of COVID. So this will give you good practice on creating methodology. So this, along with lab exercise number 2, where you generated an experimental design, will actually give you skills in terms of designing studies when we're actually not conducting a study in class. We're looking at data that's been already collected. So this is the reason behind these lab exercises. So I will talk to you later.